It is the spirit of patriotism, an organization created to protect the American way of life, defending the country during times of emergency and times of war. An unstoppable force with its roots grounded in the heritage of the citizen soldier. It is the Air National Guard. For over 50 years, the Air National Guard has been at the forefront of America's defense. Today, over 100,000 men and women make up the Air National Guard, citizen airmen who put service before self, apply professionalism to all that they do, and are dedicated to the mission. But the Guard hasn't always been an unquestioned success. At times, its very existence was threatened. The National Guard is older than the United States. It began as colonial militias that evolved into an army of revolution in 1776. The Air National Guard traces its roots back to 1908, when members of the New York National Guard began experimenting with balloons. The Army Signal Corps balloons were the foundations of National Guard aviation and laid the groundwork for air power.
Military ballooning started in France in the late 1780s, and there were a number of experiments over there. In the United States, it started in the Civil War. They used it for a couple of years in the Army of the Potomac, and it did some useful work in terms of spotting the movement of Confederate forces. Up until about World War I, there were a number of people in the Army who thought that ballooning was the most valuable and important part of aviation. There were some efforts in the Guard to form balloon companies. It was a very, very dangerous business because balloons didn't move very fast, but bullets did.
In 1910, the New York Guard raised $500 to buy a plane. The airplane crashed during maneuvers just 1 month later. In 1911, the Curtiss Aeroplane Company loaned the Guard an airplane and a pilot who was hired to train the New York Guardsmen to fly. The pilot's name was Beckwith Havens. Soon, he'd become Private Havens, the first National Guard aviator.
The first aero company was formed in New York State before the United States entered World War I, and it was an observation squadron, which meant that it would fly missions in support of the infantry divisions. The moving force behind that was Captain Reynold Cawthorn Bowling, who was a member of the New York Guard at that time. And he, like a lot of other guardsmen and people elsewhere in American life, had become very interested in the potentialities of aviation, both commercial and military.
Soon, other Guard units scrambled to embrace aviation. Guardsmen from coast to coast spent money from their own pockets to buy planes for their units. Before long, the first Aero Company was joined by the second, and other units from Missouri, California, Georgia, and Nebraska. National Guard aviation was born. March 9th, 1916. Forces led by Pancho Villa attacked the small town of Columbus, New Mexico. Outraged at the invasion of U.S. territory, President Woodrow Wilson orders troops to the Mexican border. On July 13th, Captain Bowling's first Aero Company was mobilized, but it never saw action. Instead, the planes remained at Mineola Field in New York, training. Bowling was frustrated. He was convinced that Guard aviation would never be given a chance to succeed. His report to the War Department afterward persuaded officials to disband National Guard aviation units across the country. But then came World War I. Guard aviators began volunteering for active duty. 4 guardsmen became aces during the war, Major Reed Chambers, a Tennessee Guardsman, flew with Eddie Rickenbacker on the first American combat air mission. Kansas Guardsman Irwin Bleckley flew as an aerial observer on a daring mission to resupply an Army battalion that had been cut off by German forces. Bleckley's plane was shot down, killing both he and his pilot. Irwin Bleckley became the first Guard aviator to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. In the years between World War I and World War II, Guard aviation was closely linked to commercial aviation. One of these links was a Washington State Guardsman named Reuben Fleet. Fleet delivered a new service to people across the country.
Reuben Fleet, 1918, established a mail service, something that airplanes could do for the people that would capture the imagination of the people, as well as being useful in the military. Then later on, in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh, who of course was famous by that time, joined the Missouri Guard and became an aviator. He said things such as, yes, we were motivated by patriotism, but we were also strangely motivated by a love of flight.
During the interwar period, Guard aviation units were mostly informal, gaining reputations as flying clubs. But the role of Guard flying units began to take on a more serious overtone as World War II loomed. As war broke out in Europe, several Guard aviation units were mobilized. Their aircraft were obsolete, but their aircraft mechanics were a godsend. Most Guard units were absorbed into the active Army Air Corps. A few Guard pilots were plucked from their Guard units and transferred to active duty to train and lead the huge influx of Army Air Force volunteers. August 1st, 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, a Guardsman from Ohio, flies a daring but ill-fated raid on the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania. Nazi anti-aircraft guns fill the air with flak. Baker's B-24 is destroyed, killing everyone on board. Addison Baker's bravery earned him the Medal of Honor. But despite the heroic efforts of many Guardsmen during the war, top officials questioned the usefulness of Guard aviation units in post-war defense planning. One of the most vocal opponents of an independent Air Guard was Hap Arnold.
He basically thought that the Guard was not capable of doing the things that had to be done with modern airplanes. They didn't have the time to train, they didn't have the time to mobilize, so he tried to keep them out. Basically, there was a great deal of political infighting, but again, the Guard won and basically fought for its existence, and they maintained the status as independent Air Guard.
Eventually, the Army Air Forces were persuaded to create a dual reserve system consisting of the Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve. July 26, 1947, President Harry Truman signs the National Security Act, creating a new military service, the United States Air Force. And on September 18, 1947, the Air National Guard was born. With World War II safely behind them, Americans began enjoying the fruits of a new prosperity. Veterans returned home to start families and to put the horrors of war behind them. Many of these vets joined the newly created Air National Guard.
In the summer of 1947, when the unit was first formed, a bunch of us that had returned from military service and got our jobs back at Kelly were interested. We started going over to Brooks on Thursday evenings between 7 and 9 as civilians, civilian clothes, no pay. Along came October, and a general named of Kenny came out to Hangar 5, and we all congregated there, and he swore us in, and that's when the unit was formed.
But all too soon, post-war euphoria gave way to a new war, a new kind of war, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the threat of Russian bombers over American skies was all too real. The primary mission of the new Air Guard was to defend U.S. airspace from Soviet attack. It was expected to accomplish that mission with war surplus aircraft like the prop-driven Mustang. But the Air Force was scornful. One Air Force general referred to the Air Guard as flyable storage. With many Air National Guard units poorly funded, maintenance and training suffered. In 1950, the hidden cost of that neglect came to light on a little-known peninsula in Eastern Asia called Korea.
The Korean mobilization was a mess. After World War II, the Air Force didn't have a lot of money for the Guard, didn't have a lot of money, period. The Guard consequently was equipped with obsolete planes. You know, you're flying P-51s and P-47s in a time when jet fighters were coming into the inventory. When the war came around, though, it was a war nobody had expected, and they needed units and they needed bodies. So basically you had an organization that really wasn't ready for war. It would take up to 6 months to retrain and re-equip and get some of these units ready to go.
Korea was essentially a disaster from the standpoint of Guard aviation. We learned many things as a result of Korea. We learned that we needed to have modern equipment, well-trained people that participated on a regular basis, and we needed to go to war as units.
Despite the Air Guard's rocky start, several units became valuable assets in Korea. As in earlier conflicts, individual guardsmen volunteered for active duty. 4 of them became aces. Often, what made the difference in a dogfight was not the advanced technology of the aircraft, but the advanced age of the pilot.
When the war started, here were these combat veterans that were still current flying. All of the World War II experience that we had that didn't stay on active duty, and not that many did because they cut the forces way back. They got out, they came out and they'd sign up. Our individual pilots that went over from the Air National Guard, they shined and did a superb job. That's the advantage of the Guard. Take care of that great resource, that experience we have from prior wars and prior service.
After the Korean War, the Air Guard made sweeping changes. Training was beefed up and jet fighters replaced outdated aircraft throughout the Guard. In Colorado, Korea veterans put these new planes to good use when they formed the Minutemen, a demonstration flying team. For 3 years, the Minutemen performed daring maneuvers, delighting audiences at air shows throughout the western United States. The team made its last appearance at Grand Junction, Colorado in July of 1959. The post-Korea era brought other changes in the Air Guard mission as well. By the mid-50s, the fighters on the tarmac were joined by a new breed of aircraft. In 1955, 2 C-46 cargo planes were delivered to the Guard in Hayward, California, forming the 129th Air Resupply Squadron. Cargo airframes gave the Air National Guard a world of new mission possibilities. In 1956, the New Jersey Guard used its C-46Ds to form the 150th Aeromedical Squadron. That summer, President Eisenhower signed legislation allowing nurses to join the military. In August, Captain Norma Parsons Erb became the first woman to join the Air National Guard, and soon others followed.
I guess one of the highlights of my career is becoming chief. I never expected it. I never expected to go that far. You didn't see very many women on the flight line. Our numbers grew. More careers were opened up to the women, so more women came into the service. Now, the careers are even wider. You never thought of a woman pilot, and now you can see them doing almost all the jobs that are offered to the men in the service. I was hoping to open the doors for other women. I really did, and I think I did.
1959. To continue expanding the Air Guard's mission, Major General Winston Wimpy Wilson lobbies the Air Force for even more cargo aircraft. Air Force General Curtis LeMay fights Wilson's plan, arguing that the Air National Guard can't handle large, sophisticated aircraft. The Guard, he says, should stick with fighters. But Wimpy Wilson is no wimp. Even LeMay can't stand in his way.
He saw a need for the Guard to get into the airlift business. he thought, gosh, here's some OC-97s, headed for the boneyard. And he went to get those out of the boneyard and work those, and he was able to get them, even though the Vice Chief of Staff at the time, General Curtis LeMay, was not so fond of that taking place. General Winston P. Wimpy Wilson, with his connections on the Hill and the need for the Guard to get some modernization and get into airlift, he saw where this could help the whole National Guard and make us more mobile. He was able to get 48 C-97s, and that was kind of the start of the Guard into the airlift business.
By 1960, General Wilson's C-97s formed the backbone of 6 air transport squadrons. Airlift was added to the Air National Guard's mission portfolio. The Guard stood ready to receive the call, and on August 30th, 1961, it came. Berlin, Germany. Soviet forces erect a wall that would come to symbolize communist oppression. In response, President Kennedy activates over 21,000 air guardsmen and dispatches half of them to Europe. The operation is called Stair Step. Without aerial refueling capability, the Air Guard fighters are forced to island hop their way across the Atlantic Ocean.
Because of the island hopping and the length of time that was involved in that, the Guard and the active duty recognized the need for air refueling. People realized right away that it would speed up their capability to get airplanes on station that much quicker.
Air refueling, the capability that would bring about global reach for the U.S. military, became a reality for the Air Guard in July of 1961. Units from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Ohio made the transition from fighters to KC-97 tankers and were redesignated air refueling squadrons. Guard aircraft everywhere were retrofitted to become air refuelable, making regular overseas training possible for the first time. And by the mid-60s, overseas meant Vietnam.
The initial involvement of the Air Guard in Vietnam was in late 1965. There was a program generated to send cookies and gifts and stuff like that to servicemen in Vietnam. So Guard airlift units flying on a volunteer basis became very involved in flying that stuff over there.
As Vietnam heated up, Air Guardsmen began training in earnest. Drill weekends were spent practicing rescue operations. Guardsmen trained for riot control in the event of civil unrest, and hand-to-hand combat became part of the regiment. These special skills would serve them well in the coming months. January 1968, North Korea captures the USS Pueblo, an American spy ship. President Johnson must take action but can't afford another war. His response? Call out the Guard.
I was walking across the hangar floor of the Kentucky Air Guard on late January 1968 when on the air came President Johnson, said, "I'm here to announce a partial mobilization of the National Guard and Reserve due to the crisis in Korea." And we were already overextended in Vietnam. It looked like we were going to have a war on 2 fronts.
Over 10,000 Air National Guardsmen were mobilized that year, and none too soon. Within a month of the Pueblo crisis, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive. Between Korea and Vietnam, American forces were stretched to their limit. After the Tet Offensive, 4 Guard fighter units were sent to Vietnam. The 355th Tactical Fighter Wing was officially an Air Force unit, but 85% of its members were Guardsmen.
A half a dozen or more of the Air Guard F-100 units went over to Vietnam and saw a considerable combat action. In fact, flew something like 30,000 combat sorties and did a superb job. General George S. Brown thought the Air Guard units did superb and fought superbly over in Vietnam.
The war in Vietnam proved the Air Guard's readiness. For the first time in its history, deployed units were well trained and well equipped, paving the way for challenges to come. As the Vietnam War raged on, valuable Air Force resources such as air refueling aircraft were being used almost exclusively to support the war. The active duty tanker force had become too busy to support operations in Europe. To fill the gap, the Air Force turned to the Air National Guard. The Guard's propeller-driven KC-97L tankers had been fitted with jet engines, allowing them to refuel the faster bombers and fighters. Testing began over Germany. It quickly became obvious that the Air National Guard could do the job. The refueling mission over Europe became known as Operation Creek Party. It was the Air Guard's first sustained overseas operation, and it was handled primarily by volunteers.
One unit would go in, and they would take it for a certain period of time, and then as they left, another Guard unit would come in right behind them and take over for, again, for about a month. Of course, the Guard at that time still was flying KC-97s, which was an older airplane. Active duty had already converted to KC-135s, but in spite of that, the Guard still did a great job with the KC-97.
Air National Guard personnel and aircraft provided refueling to Air Force and NATO aircraft for 10 years, flying over 6,000 sorties without a single accident. The success of Operation Creek Party gave rise to a concept that would shape the future of the U.S. military: total force. Under the total force policy, Guard and Reserve units would be better integrated into the everyday operations of the Air Force. With a beefed-up budget, the Air National Guard embraced the total force concept with zeal, modernizing its equipment and aircraft. By the 1980s, overseas operations had become routine for the Guard as new and unique missions emerged. In 1983, Pennsylvania's 193rd Special Operations Group flew its EC-130 Volant Solos over Grenada, aiding in the evacuation of U.S. citizens during Operation Urgent Fury. The Special Operations mission has a long history in the Air Guard, and the EC-130 is an aircraft unlike any other in the Air Force inventory.
The mission really hasn't changed a lot over the 32-year period, although the airplane certainly has. We still broadcast information to a target audience, and that audience can be a military audience and it can be a civilian audience to achieve certain ends of the campaign.
The Air Guard's presence overseas has reached even the harshest environment on Earth. In 1988, the 109th Tactical Airlift Group from New York began flying missions to Antarctica, delivering supplies to scientists from the National Science Foundation. The mission was called Operation Deep Freeze. The 109th's LC-130s were equipped with skis for landing on the ice that served as a runway. Gradually, the Air Guard took over this responsibility from the Navy, and the 109th continues this mission today. From the frozen reaches of Antarctica to the jungles of Central and South America, the Air National Guard continued its global reach. Air Guard C-130s became the primary airlifters for the U.S. Southern Command. Guard units began training in Panama and Honduras. Civil engineers built roads and schools, and communications technicians manned radar sites to monitor drug-running aircraft. And when Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega's number was finally up, the Air National Guard was already there.
When we got to Just Cause, we already had A-7s down there. I had another state call and say, "Hey John, don't start that war without me. We want to send our fighters down there too." We had C-130s down there in operation, and General Max Thurman said, "I couldn't have done it without the National Guard, Army and Air, for Just Cause." And that was all done in a short war and an all-voluntary basis.
Noriega's tyranny was over, but half a world away, the Air Guard's participation in the total force was about to be put to the ultimate test. August 2nd, 1990. Iraqi tanks invade the tiny nation of Kuwait. President Bush responds with what will become the largest American military buildup since World War II. Within a week of the invasion, Air National Guard volunteers arrive in Saudi Arabia. Desert Shield has begun.
Almost 25% of the entire Air Force involved in Desert Shield, Desert Storm came from the Guard and Reserve. Our airlift units played an extremely important part. Just hours after the invasion, our tanker force, again, had to provide the bridge for our immediate response of our fighter force to get into that theater of operation. Desert Shield and Desert Storm put total force more in perspective than any other conflict that we were involved in.
The need for airlift and air refueling was staggering. Air Guard volunteers from across the country deployed in massive numbers. By the 22nd of August, when President Bush authorized a recall of the Guard and Reserves, over 10,000 volunteers were already on active duty. Tailored packages of Air Guard personnel and equipment were sent to the Persian Gulf to satisfy the needs of the active duty Air Force. Security police teams, airlift control elements, and medical evacuation personnel were critical to the mission. As Desert Shield became Desert Storm, Air Guard fighters struck deep in the heart of Saddam's territory. Guard F-16s from South Carolina and New York pounded Iraqi targets alongside their active duty counterparts. Air Guard tankers provided much-needed fuel, and Guard airlift moved troops and equipment throughout the Gulf region. Military leaders were convinced victory in the Gulf War would not have been possible without the Air National Guard.
It was one of my proudest moments of all of my National Guard history, was the great success of the Air National Guard in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. It was a real total force effort, and I couldn't have been prouder of the Air Guard passing that big ORI for real over Desert Storm.
As the last icons of Soviet communism crumbled, military strategies developed in the Cold War became obsolete. After Desert Storm, the active duty military downsized. Missions that had once fallen under the Air Force now became the domain of the Air Guard. In 1994, the Air National Guard began taking charge of the 1st Air Force, assuming sole responsibility for air defense of the continental United States. New aircraft were also added to the Air Guard inventory, with heavy bomber units forming in Kansas and Georgia. Critical tasks like combat communications now fell under Air Guard control, with the Guard operating nearly 70% of all combat communications assets. The Air National Guard was now an essential part of America's total force. Hotspots flared up worldwide, and the Air National Guard was there, delivering food to Somalia and assisting in peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. But when war became ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, the stage was set for confrontation. April 27, 1999, President Clinton orders a call-up of Guardsmen and reservists to assist in Operation Allied Force. Over 3,000 Air Guardsmen are mobilized, and volunteers from across the country add to their ranks. A-10 Warthogs from Idaho, Michigan, and Massachusetts come together to form the 131st Expeditionary Fighter Squadron. It is one of the fastest mobilizations on record.
Within 1 week of a warning notice, these people have prepared their airplane, packed their equipment, mobilized it, got their people ready, have deployed it, and they're sitting on a ramp here right now ready to go. That's the Guard at its best.
NATO fighters destroyed numerous targets in Yugoslavia. Those fighters were refueled by Guard KC-135s. Guard A-10s, delivering crushing blows to Serb targets, flew over 500 combat sorties. The dedication of the Air National Guard played a key role in the success of Operation Allied Force.
Allied Force was a conflict that the Guard and Reserves were totally involved in from day one. We performed second to none. It was an incredible feat, but we expect that. It was just an incredible total force operation. I couldn't have been more proud of all of them, each and every one.
The victories of today's Air Guard are not the product of coincidence or luck. They're the result of enduring effort, dedication, and sacrifice, the legacy of hundreds of thousands of Guardsmen and women who blazed the trail, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. lives given in the service of a higher mission. The history of the Air National Guard remains a uniquely American story.
I think it's a part of Americana as much as mom and apple pie. You know, the National Guard and the militia go back to before there was a United States. I mean, it's older than the Republic.
We are even more relevant today in this changing world than we were in the beginning. We are essential to a smoothly functioning military. I see a very, very bright future for the Air National Guard.
The Guard's alive and well and awake, and I know General Wimpy Wilson up there has got to be proud of all the great things that 100,000+ men and women of the Air National Guard are doing today, and it's absolutely phenomenal. But you know the old saying on the Archives building in Washington, the past is prologue. What that means to me as a good old Kentuckian is, and it pertains to the Air National Guard of next century, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Throughout its history, the Air National Guard has flourished by adapting to changing missions. Filled with both triumph and tragedy, the rich history of the Air Guard is still being written by today's citizen airmen, men and women who embody the spirit of the Minutemen. They are our friends and neighbors, the warriors who live next door. They're the ones who stand ready to receive the call. They're the men and women of the Air National Guard.